Hello, everybody. Welcome to our review session for AP Environmental Science. My name is Dr. Sowell, and I teach APES down here in Jacksonville, Florida. So just before we get started, another quick reminder of our exam date and the two types of questions we have. First one being design and investigation, and second one is environmental problem and solution. So a quick note, I want to reiterate what Ms. Fassler said yesterday about a really useful page that talks about tips for success on open book, open note exams. Remember, this year's exam is going to ask you to apply information and to use information in contexts in terms of experiments or environmental problems and solutions. So taking notes on these videos that Ms. Fassler and I are making are great sources of information. But I would highly recommend looking at this URL, this page here, for some tips about how to best organize that kind of material. I also want to point out a new feature on AP Classroom that you may have heard from your teacher. If not, I wanted to point it out here. You now have access to more practice free response questions. So you can go on there and select to do those yourself. They don't need to be assigned to you by your teacher, and you can practice them and check the rubric when you're all done. But it's just another nice resource for you to practice some FRQs. All right, so first of all, happy Earth Day. Yay, happy birthday. I know Ms. Fassler said wear a Hawaiian or a tie-dye shirt, but I don't have one. So instead, we're gonna have a little music interlude for happy Earth Day, so enjoy.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue, clouds of white, bright, blessed days, dark, sacred night. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colours of a rainbow, so pretty in the sky, also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Quite simply wonderful.
So happy Earth Day, everybody. I know you may be sequestered at home with quarantine or having your movements restricted, so you may not be able to go outside and enjoy Earth Day, the nature outside. But if you can't, find a documentary, especially one narrated by David Attenborough. Really great presenter. So let's warm up using the FRQ that Ms. Fassler gave you for homework last time about sediment runoff in undisturbed areas versus clear cutting areas. And it gave you a graph with two y-axes. Remember to always look for the axes and kind of dissect the graph before you jump right into it. So the first question said, identify the day of the study when the largest amount of sediment was present in runoff. So if we look for sediments, we know that this line here is rainfall, and that's using this y-axis over here. And then the sediment in the non-vegetated versus vegetated areas are in the bars. So if I'm looking for the largest amount of runoff, here's the largest amount of runoff. It is on day 98. So day 98 was when we had the largest amount of sediment in the runoff. Please remember, if it says identify a day or identify a value or identify a number, it's not asking for a range. If you said somewhere between day 95 and day 100, that would not be acceptable. Identify means to give a particular value or number. Second one, describe the relationship between rainfall and sediment in the runoff. And clearly we can see that after big rain events, there was more sediment in the runoff. Based on the graph, explain how clear cutting has affected the water quality in nearby streams. So not only does clear cutting affect the amount of sediment in the runoff, but it can affect the quality of nearby streams. So you could increase the turbidity. So there was an increased amount of runoff and sediment in the water. This could therefore increase the water temperature compared with the undisturbed areas as a result of a lack of vegetation at the mining locations. So this is asking for an explanation, so much more than just a description. And this one says, forests are often considered a commons or a shared resource. They can often experience the tragedy of the commons. Describe one potential approach to reducing the occurrence of the tragedy of the commons in forests. So you could do things like legislation. You could pass a law that regulates how that resource is used. You could come up with a quota. You could only harvest so many trees, or perhaps there was a quota of trees that you had to replant. Another one is privatization, because we know a lot of times human beings will take care of their private property more than they will a shared resource like the commons. All right, so hopefully you did wonderfully on that. So let's jump into where we're going to go today. So today is all about more agricultural practices. So our goal is to talk about irrigation methods. So list some ways that we irrigate our crops. Look at pest control methods. How do we deal with pests on our crops? Meat production, how we produce meat, and then looking at 2 solutions for more sustainable agricultural practices, which are integrated pest management and a bunch of sustainable agricultural practices we'll list. We are also going to spend some time with science practice number 4, scientific experiments. Remember, that's the backbone of FRQ number 1. It's going to have some sort of work with experiments. So we're going to practice that twice today during this lesson, once in the middle of the lesson and once again for homework tonight for the FRQ. All right, so let's jump into it. So the first things are the irrigation methods. So after this little section, you should be able to describe the different types of irrigation and then the pros and the cons of each. And then that's kind of the description phase, and then be able to explain how different types of irrigations might have certain effects on the environment. So remember, we want to not just identify, yes, I know what drip irrigation is, but you need to be able to describe it. What are the characteristics of drip irrigation? And then explain it. How might you use drip irrigation to mitigate some environmental effect? So first of all, we'll talk about the different methods. We'll talk about the pros and cons of each method. And then we're going to talk about 2 particular soil irrigation issues, soil salinization and waterlogging. And then we'll also mention briefly the Ogallala Aquifer. All right, so let's start with this basic statistic. The largest human use of fresh water is for irrigation, 70%. That's huge. That means of all the fresh water we use on the planet, 70% of it we use to put on our crops to grow. So if we're using that much water, we really should be trying to do it in the most sustainable way possible. Why? Because we are using it unsustainably in a lot of locations. So remember, irrigation is the use of surface or groundwater for growing crops. And if we are consuming and using that water in a faster rate that it's being replenished, then it's unsustainable. And that's the current state or the current threat to the Ogallala Aquifer in the West. And so the Ogallala Aquifer is an example of a commons. So that means a resource that is owned by no one, that everybody has access to. And if we overuse that, that's when the tragedy of the commons takes place. And Ms. Fassler did a good example of talking about that last time in terms of the Ogallala Aquifer. So we need to be smart about how we irrigate. So we've got, other than over withdrawing, we've got 2 other unique problems that I've mentioned, waterlogging and salinization. So let's start with waterlogging. It's pretty basic, pretty simple. It's just when we've filled the soil with water. We've saturated that rooting zone in the soil. So instead of it being a zone of aeration that is sometimes filled with water, it's permanently waterlogged. It's got water all in there. It's saturated. So while plants do need water, they also need air. The roots need air. And so having that soil filled with water, all of those pores filled with water, the air can't get to the roots and therefore growth is inhibited. And then second, we have salinization. So here's my example of salinization. If I had a pot of boiling water, boiling salt water, if I put salt water in a pot and boiled it, the water would fly off, would evaporate, and what would be left in the pot? Salt. Well, that's the same thing that can happen as a response to irrigation. So if we irrigate with groundwater, not with rainwater, but irrigate with groundwater, which has some salt in it, if any of that water stands on the surface of the ground and is evaporated, the salt is left behind. So salinization occurs when the salts in the groundwater remain in the soil after the water evaporates. Over time, salinization can make the soil toxic to plants. So that can happen naturally. Salinization can naturally occur in places, but most of the time it's caused by our over-irrigating a field or poorly draining it. And think about different soil types that we mentioned before and how that might be involved in water drainage as well. So we don't want our soil to be logged with water, and we don't want it to be over salted, too much salinity. If you think back to the LD50 experiment we did with the seeds, we looked at how different concentrations of salt affect seeds, and you saw some clear effects of salinization there. How do you prevent that or clean it up? It's really hard. Obviously, you could reduce your irrigation. You could use better irrigation practices. But if it's already occurred, removing that salt really takes a lot of time and money. You have to flush it out with lots of water. You could switch to salt-tolerant crops that are more tolerable of those salt levels. But soil salinization is a significant problem with pretty extensive solutions, hard solutions. All right, so thinking of those problems in mind, let's look at these 4 irrigation practices. So we've got furrow and flood. The commonality there is we're just putting water on the surface of the ground. The water is going right on to the soil itself. Spray irrigation is probably what you're most familiar with, like a giant sprinkler system in a field. And then drip irrigation is kind of unique and new. So let's start with furrow. Furrow is like what it sounds. It cuts these large furrows into the field, and then you flood them with water. It's super cheap. Dig a hole, put water in it. Dig a trench, put water in it. The problem is it's a high rate of evaporation and runoff. That means you're losing 33% of that water that could have gone to your plants is now simply evaporating and possibly leaving salt behind, or it's just running off. So you're losing that water. So a big risk of erosion as well. So here's some other pictures of furrow. You can see the little row of crops here. Then in between are these furrows that this pipe is flooding with water. Same thing here. I found this little clip that I thought I'd show just a couple of seconds of. It shows a really unique example of furrow irrigation. He opens up that furrow, or closes that first furrow off. The water flows through to the second furrow. And as soon as that's full, he'll keep going and going and going.
Yeah.
So kind of cool, but does have a high risk of evaporation and runoff. And then flooding is very similar, but instead of having those furrows, you just flood the whole field. Again, inexpensive, but a lot is lost to evaporation and runoff. And again, the same issues of waterlogging, salinization, and then erosion from the field. So you can see it here in an orchard. This is some alfalfa. And then we have spray. This is where we have pipes and sprinkler systems and big tools and big equipment, some electricity probably to run those pumps. So it's more expensive, but less is lost to evaporation and runoff, about a little less than 0.25% on average. And you may have seen these large devices, these irrigation devices in agricultural fields, and you can see the water being sprayed onto the crop. And then finally, we've got drip irrigation. This is substantially more expensive just because of the labor and the materials needed. But it's really good because only 5% is lost to evaporation and runoff. Because of the expense, it is not often used. In a nutshell, it's a hose with some tiny holes in it. So this hose has these little perforation or holes in it, and the water simply drips out. So it doesn't gather at the surface to evaporate, nor does it just spray everywhere with the risk of evaporation. It's targeted right into the soil, right next to the roots of the plant. So a very unique system, but it is expensive and not often used. So when you think about these irrigation types, not only should you be able to describe them, but also relate them to different problems such as over-withdrawal of groundwater or aquifers, waterlogging, and salinization. All right, let's shift gears and talk about pests. Pests are anything that's competing with us for our food, for our resources. So we gotta deal with them. We gotta eliminate them somehow or reduce their population somehow. So at the end of this section, you should be able to describe the benefits and drawbacks of different pest control methods. So to get there, we'll talk about some different types of pesticides. We'll talk about how some pests become pesticide resistant. And then we'll talk about mobility in pesticides and how that can have a broader, far-reaching effect than just being sprayed upon the field itself. All right, so what is a pesticide? It's just something that's going to decrease crop damage and increase crop yield. Be sure you understand that phrase crop yield, the amount of crops that can be harvested from a certain area. So if I'm using pesticides, I'm reducing the amount of damage to those crops, therefore I'm getting more out of my field. What are some different types I can use? I could start with an herbicide maybe. So an herbicide is going to kill weeds. And if I remove the weeds from my field, there's less competition for light, for water, for nutrients. So herbicides are going to get rid of plants. Fungicides get rid of fungus. Rodenticides get rid of rodents. Insecticides get rid of insects. So there's a wide variety of pesticides we could use. There's also a wide variety of ways we can spray them onto fields or get them onto fields. It could be done by airplane. You could spray the pesticides from above, be on a tractor system that sprays it, or it could even be done by hand. The thing that we need to be mindful of if it is done by hand is that this individual has much more of a risk of negative health effects from those pesticides if precautions and proper use are not followed. So I mentioned before the idea of mobility. So if I have a pest in my field and I want to get rid of it, my thought is to spray it on the field and the pest will go away. This target pest will go away. Well, that's my intended path, but what actually happens might be quite different. Some of that might be blown off by wind into another area, might be runoff from rainwater and goes into a stream. And once it leaves that field, it can get into other food webs and food chains far, far away from the field that I intended it. It may blow into a forest nearby, or it might get into small insects that then biomagnifies up through the trophic levels to larger organisms. So we need to be mindful that certain pesticides, especially those that are persistent and mobile, can have some big consequences other than just killing this pest. This is what we saw with DDT. This is Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring, where she warned us about these kinds of dangers. And DDT was particularly bad because it was a broad spectrum pesticide. It killed a wide range of insects, as opposed to a narrow spectrum pesticide that might just target one particular species or group of insects. And so famously, we've heard, and I think Ms. Fassler mentioned this before, about the thinning of eggshells in large birds as that DDT bioaccumulated and biomagnified up the food chain. And one of the interesting results is that it thinned out some of the eggshells and we saw a loss of those bird populations. So if we just take a look at this graph, there's another kind of unintended consequence of our pesticide use. On the x-axis is year, and on the y-axis is number of resistant insect and mite species. So this means the more we use pesticides year after year after year, we're seeing a bigger and bigger and bigger increase in the number of insects who are resistant to that insecticide or that pesticide. Why is this happening? This is all about adaptation. So remember back in our conversation of adaptation, we talked about how a population with a wide or a very diverse genetic pool. Some of those individuals may have particular traits caused by mutations that are beneficial for them to survive. We saw this with the adaptations on the megaplate, the bacteria becoming resistant to the antibiotics. Same thing's going on here, that we are spraying pesticides. Some pests are becoming resistant, so we add more pesticides or different pesticides, and we just keep going and going and doing it and doing it. That's called the pesticide treadmill. So here's another diagram illustrating the same thing. So we start here, we apply our pesticide. Most of our pests die, but some are resistant, and those resistant ones repopulate. Well, I go back out in my field and I think, well, I just did this pesticide, but it must not be working. Let me put some more on there. So I put some more on there, but it doesn't have any effect because they're already resistant. So now I have a worse infestation. What do I have to do now? I have to go to a new pesticide, something different, and then the process starts all over and over again. It's a classic arms race. You know, the pest develops resistant, we develop stronger or different pesticides, and back and forth and back and forth. This is a great place to go back and look at Ms. Fassler's conversation in her previous lesson. It was around minute 43. She talked about this great question where there was an experiment about glyphosate-resistant weeds. And around that time, she also had conversations about genetically modified organisms like Roundup-ready crops and BT corn. So those genetically modified organisms are a unique way to deal with pests as opposed to just spraying pesticide on them. We can genetically engineer organisms to be either resistant to pests or resistant to like an herbicide that might kill it normally. So I would have you go back and look at that conversation because she did a brilliant discussion of that. So we're going to pause for a second and go down the experiment pathway. So we know that practice number 4, scientific experiments, forms the basis of some of the parts of question number 1. It says analyze research studies that test environmental principles. So we are going to look at an experiment today about fungicide. So I'm going to show you the clip, and after we're done with the clip, I want you to answer these questions. So write these down really quick so that you can answer them as we go through. So first of all, I want you to identify the hypothesis. So just dot down hypothesis equals and fill it in as we go through the video. The second one is what is the independent variable, then the dependent variable, the control group. 5 says, how might we modify the experiment to improve the findings? And 6, what's the so what? How are we supposed to change our agricultural practices based on the results of the experiment? So I'm going to be quiet for a minute and give you a chance to write down shortened versions of those questions. All right, so I'm going to play the film now. It's about 5 minutes long, and it's going to talk about an experiment about fungicides. And when we're all done, we'll go over the answers to these questions. All right, here we go.
We spray lots of chemicals on plants. Fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides. Could some of these chemicals have harmful effects on pollinators like bees? There are almost 4,000 species of native bees in North America, but some of these species are declining. As a conservation photographer working on bees, I wanted to learn whether fungicides are one of the reasons our native bees are in trouble. So I visited entomologist Sean Steffen at the University of Wisconsin.
So our work is primarily focused on isolating the mechanism by which fungicides may be harming native bee species.
I didn't see how a chemical designed to kill fungus would affect bees, but Sean explained that some microscopic fungi, like yeasts, have an unexpected connection with bees.
So in nature, microbes are everywhere. When bees go out and get pollen from the flower, they bring it back to the nest. So you bring back this protein-rich, wet, sticky, sweet soup. What's to keep it from spoiling in the course of 2, 3, 4 days? It appears that fungi help to preserve these pollen provisions.
Inside the nest, the growing bumblebee larvae feed on this pollen mixture. Sean wants to figure out what kinds of fungi and other microbes these provisions contain. So he begins by dissecting a bumblebee nest in the lab.
We open up these large larval cells, and we get little bits of uneaten pollen. That pollen has fermented. We take it out and then culture it on a plate.
Culturing microbes from the bees' pollen provisions, in other words, growing them in the lab, allows Sean to isolate the microbes and identify them by their appearance and genetics. He's finding that yeast are a major component of bumblebees' diets.
These larval bees, this is the only food they get. And it appears that some bee species, by the time they finish eating their pollen provision, that pollen provision is more yeast than pollen.
So is it possible that fungicides in the environment harm the yeast and other fungi that the developing bees depend on?
There are all these microbes in the pollen that, a lot of those are fungi. And if you have fungicide residue in that pollen, it stands to reason that the fungi would suffer.
And if the fungi suffer, the bee larvae might suffer too. That's the hypothesis that Sean wanted to test. He placed 10 bumblebee colonies, all about the same size, into outdoor cages containing flowers. There was 1 colony per cage, and in half the cages, the flowers were treated with a fungicide.
The bumblebee colonies could only forage at the flowers that we provided. At the end of the trial, it lasted a month. The control bees, they averaged about 43 individuals per colony. The colonies that were exposed to fungicide residues on flowers, they averaged about 12. Wow. We're talking about a profound effect. This is basically what appears to be like the first hard evidence that a fungicide, not applied to adults, but just on the flowers, caused major colony declines in a single bumblebee species, Bombus impatiens. There's lots of data that show fungicides sprayed directly on adult bees, they're harmless. Those bees are, okay. What we're saying is, well, the pathway by which the fungicide hurts the bees, it doesn't appear to hurt the adult. It hurts the larva. Again, this is just one fungicide, and it's just one bumblebee species.
With thousands of native bee species in North America and many different fungicides used on our crops and ornamental plants, there's still plenty of work to do to understand the effects of fungicides on wild pollinators. But Sean's experiments so far suggest that because of the intimate relationship between bees and fungi, we need to pay close attention to how we use fungicides.
Fungicides are sprayed globally, legally, according to their label, on flowering crops. Some fungicides may be truly harmless, but it's looking like some are not. We're not saying that fungicides should need to be banned in any sense, but there are things that can be done. You can spray before bloom, you can spray after bloom. And so our goal is to figure out which ones are not so good, why they're not so good, basically figure out what it is about them that makes them harmful to bees, and hopefully that will inform policy.
So a really great experiment that dovetails perfectly with our course. We have an issue, a problem, pesticides. We can use an experiment to better understand that problem, and then make some recommendations about how to change practice. So let's go over the answers real quick. So the hypothesis was that the presence of the fungicide would negatively affect the larva, the bee population. So the independent variable was the presence or absence of fungicide, and the dependent variable was the population, the number of bees in the colony. What was the control group? The control group were the test cages without the fungicide. How might we modify it to get different or better findings? One of the things that came up to mind for me is, instead of having some with the pesticide and some without the pesticide, perhaps we had the control without, but then for my experimental groups, I expand it so that I have a low amount of fungicide, a medium amount of fungicide, a really high amount of fungicide. So instead of getting a yes or no type answer like we got here with this experiment, yes, it did affect them, we could actually get an answer that maybe say, how might it affect them? To what degree does it affect them? How do the concentrations of fungicide affect them? So having more experimental groups would give you more robust findings and can give you kind of a different, more robust answer. And finally, how are we going to change farming practices? Well, it was indicated there, spray the fungicide before or after bloom. So something to think about. All right, so let's switch gears completely from bumblebees and pesticides to meat. So we're going to talk about meat production now. So after this section, you should be able to identify the different methods of meat production and then their pros and cons. So we'll start by investigating a CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operation. Then we'll look at the impacts of meat production on land and water. Talk about free range grazing is a potential solution. We'll talk about the effects of overgrazing, and then how meat production methods contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So let's start with just some overview of how we eat meat as human beings. So we know that about 40% of the calories consumed in developed countries comes from meat, as opposed to developing countries, only about 5%. Now, clearly those are averages, it's not an exact number, but there is a definite trend toward the more developed a country is, the more meat it consumes, because meat is much more expensive and resource dependent than eating vegetarian meals. So if you're going to eat meat, you've got to pay more for more land and more resources. So one way we do it in industrialized countries is CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding lots, sometimes called feedlots. So these CAFOs are a quick and efficient method to get the livestock ready for slaughter, meaning it is a lot less expensive and it's a lot quicker than other methods. This gets the cows or the livestock ready for slaughter much quicker, so it's efficient. And it's concentrated, so all the animals are in one location, very dense concentration of animals. And they're typically fed grains as opposed to grass. And that grain sometimes is not as suitable for their diets as the natural grass would be. Because it's so inexpensive, it reduces the cost for consumers for meat. So when you go to the grocery store and buy meat, the cheap price is typically because of the cheap way that it was raised. So let's talk about some problems associated with a CAFO. Well, first of all, you've got all those livestock living in one location. You're going to have lots of waste that can easily contaminate soil or run off into surface waters and cause issues such as eutrophication, nutrient pollution, hypoxic conditions, things like that. And because they're so packed together, we do have a risk of disease, a much higher risk of disease than normal. And that's a density dependent factor. Because the risk of disease is so high, there is typically an increased use of antibiotics to keep the livestock healthy. And just like we saw with the pesticide treadmill, we could have some disease-causing bacteria, viruses, fungi, whatever it might be, becoming resistant to those antibiotics. So this is an example of an FRQ from 2001. We're not going to go over the answer today, but I would highly recommend you looking at this because it's a great experiment, a description of an experiment that took place near a hog farm. And these individuals were studying how this hog farm affected this stream. And so they measured the dissolved oxygen, phosphate, nitrate, and pH. And the questions kind of walk you through an understanding of that experiment. Again, not going to go over it now, but I highly recommend taking a look at that And again, it's from 2001. All right, so now I want us to contrast that CAFO, those feedlots with lots of livestock, cattle all in one place, to more traditional free range grazing. So this is a situation in which the animals graze their entire lifetime. So they're not eating that grain or other feed that's been produced, they're eating their normal grasses that they're eating. Because they're not so squished together and concentrated, there's less use of antibiotics. And just think about what their waste can do to the landscape. It's used as fertilizer. So it sounds pretty ideal. Well, what are the cons? It takes a lot of land. You have to have space for this to happen. And therefore, it's more expensive to raise this livestock to slaughter, and therefore it's more expensive to consumers. Another unique problem of raising cattle is methane. Cows naturally produce methane as a result of their digestive processes. So that one cow in and of itself making methane, no big deal, no big whoop. One cow in the middle of nowhere, no big deal. But we have millions and millions of cows. You know, the population of cows in the United States is really, really big because we have so many for meat production. And in fact, it's so much that if we look at the US methane emissions by source, it parallels the natural gas industry. So why do we care about methane? Greenhouse gas. It is one of the main greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change, global warming and climate change. So another little thing to think about in terms of the amount of land required to raise livestock is simply looking at the possibilities of eating less meat. What are the benefits of eating lower on the trophic levels? So it takes about 20% more land to produce the same amount of calories from meat as from plants. So in other words, there's an environmental benefit for eating lower on the trophic level. So we can take a look at this trophic pyramid here. So this amount of land produces this many cows, and that can support this many people who eat meat. That same amount of land, if these individuals ate from the land, can support more human beings. So there are some environmental benefits of the human population eating perhaps less meat. All right, another con of the livestock industry or meat production is overgrazing. If we have too many animals on the land, we can start using it unsustainably and have some real bad soil degradation. And that's the tragedy of the commons. In fact, this was the example that Garrett Hardin used in his original article about the tragedy of the commons, how multiple ranchers and farmers were putting increasing numbers of cattle on a shared pasture, and in the collective effort crashed that system. And that was the tragedy of the commons. Why is that bad? We've got soil compaction. So all those hooves squashing all over that soil a lot is affecting the porosity and permeability and structural, the physical nature of the soil. Might have loss of vegetation, and we know that roots hold in soil. And so once we lose the vegetation, we lose a lot of soil to erosion, and we could even risk desertification in some arid areas. So what's the solution? It's rotational grazing. Rotational grazing just means I'm going to graze you in one location, and then I'm going to section it off and put you in another location. And that way, the first location has a chance to rebound and regrow. So it is rotating the different pastures that cattle feed in or other livestock feed in so that the older ones can be restored. So that's rotational grazing. All right, now let's look at integrated pest management. This is kind of a cool topic, and it's a much more sustainable approach to dealing with pests. The descriptions we talked about before, there's a pest, spray the pesticide, and that's it. That's all the thought process that needs to happen. I look at the label and said, yep, it'll kill that thing, kill that thing. Integrated pest management really is very similar to that bumblebee experiment we saw a minute ago, where you have to kind of understand the ecology of the whole system before you make smart choices about how to deal with pests. So to understand IPM, we're going to do the following. We'll first describe the components, what makes an IPM strategy. We'll talk about some pros and cons, and then we'll actually look at a unique unintended consequence sometimes associated with biological controls. So what is IPM? IPM is an ecosystem-based strategy that focuses on long-term management, not eradication of pests. there's the presupposition with traditional pest control that the goal is to eliminate all the pests. I have pest X in my field. I want a pesticide that gets rid of all of that. IPM says, well, that's not the goal. That's not feasible. We want to get them to a economically manageable level. And so the whole purpose, again, is to lower the impact on the environment from pest control. So how do we do this? Well, we first have to understand the life cycle of the pest, understanding how it interacts with the environment. It takes some ecology and natural history knowledge. One of the misconceptions is that within an IPM plan, you never use pesticides. No, you can use pesticides when it's absolutely necessary. But if you do, you plan it out very well, and ideally you use a narrow spectrum pesticide that targets just the pest itself and not other beneficial organisms. So let's look at some actual methods. So IPM methods are sometimes cultural, physical, biological, chemical, as opposed to just chemical, just the pesticide. It's taking a holistic look. So here's some examples. In terms of cultural, you just change your behavior, change your practices. So for example, intercropping, planting different types of crops right next to each other in a field. Now, some of those crops might naturally produce a chemical that wards off pests, or you might want to plant a crop that is really, really attractive to the pest, and so you'll have it eat that thing while your cash crop, the thing that you're trying to harvest, is growing just fine. So intercropping is a way that we just change our agricultural practices to minimize pest damage. You could do physical controls, trap them, keep them out, put a big net over your field to prevent birds from getting down into it, or put a fence around your chicken coop from the coyotes getting in, or whatever it might be. But it's physical barriers. Vacuuming is an interesting idea, to take a vacuum and just suck up the pests. Biological, introduce predators. Introduce a predator of that pest that will take care of it for you. I always think, nature doesn't need us to go in and add pesticides to wilderness areas. There's natural habitats that support a wide variety of niches, including niches for predators. So if we can mimic as much as possible nature within our agricultural settings, we can enhance the likelihood that those natural predators will be there because we've mimicked more of a realistic food web. So here's some examples. So farm workers may release sterile male pests, and so therefore they may mate with the females but produce no offspring. Planting something for natural predators to exist in, putting in some of that BT corn, or those genetically modified organisms that are resistant to pests. Sometimes spraying pesticides if we absolutely need to. Traps for females. Here's another example of intercropping, molasses grass planted with corn, and it repels some of the corn pests. So you can see it's a much more holistic, varied approach. Overall, if we do that, we reduce the risk that pesticides pose to wildlife, water supplies, and human health. And we also have to consider the fact that this can be more expensive and it's much more complex. The knowledge base alone requires a much more thorough examination of the agricultural setting and the ecology of the area. So I'll end our discussion of biological controls here with the famous example of the cane toad. You may have talked about this in your apes class, but this is the famous example of the toad being brought into Australia. It wasn't native to Australia, it was brought into Australia, and unfortunately became very, very, very invasive. It's an invasive species now. It was brought in as a biological control for a grub that was eating crops, but instead this toad kind of took over. Classic example of how an R-selected species managed to become a very dangerous invasive species in Australia. There's a great, weird documentary called Cane Toads: An Unnatural History. If you haven't seen it, definitely find it and see it. All right, so we're going to end today talking about a few sustainable agricultural and food production practices, but mainly we're going to talk about soil conservation and soil fertility, ways in which we can alter our agricultural practices to reduce erosion and to maintain the nutrients within our soil, because those two things are important for agriculture. We need soil and we need fertile soil, so we need to find agricultural practices that will sustain that. So overall, sustainable agriculture looks to avoid or reduce these things: tillage, tillage or preparing land for planting is typically very disruptive with the plows and machines that will open up the soil, remove plants' roots, kind of disrupt the microbes that are living in the soil. So tillage is something to consider. We don't want any bare ground. Bare ground equals more erosion. We like to have our soil grabbed onto by roots to maintain soil in the place that we want it to be and not erode somewhere else. We want to reduce our reliance on inorganic fertilizers, maybe think of something like compost, and then also reduced hormones or antibiotic use for livestock. All right, so let's take a look at a few of those. Well, the three famous ones to reduce wind and water erosion are contour plowing, windbreaks, and terracing. You've probably seen pictures like this before where contour plowing and terracing really well, first of all, contour plowing follows the contour of a hill as opposed to going straight up and down a hill, and that reduces the effect of water erosion. Terracing does something kind of similar, but it actually cuts into a slope or a hill, these like steps, and this also prevents water erosion or reduces water erosion. To reduce wind erosion, we use windbreaks or shelter breaks, and that's just going to lower the impact of wind blowing across a field, so big hedgerows or rows of trees. Another way to reduce erosion is to think about using perennial crops as opposed to an annual crop. So an annual crop grows one year, I harvest it, and I get rid of it. So it only lives, less than a year. And when I get rid of it, by taking it out, I'm exposing the soil and I'm, increasing the chances of erosion. If I use a perennial crop, it lives many, many years and can be harvested many, many times before it dies. So again, just a chance to lock in the roots to the soil a little bit longer. No-till agriculture. So traditional tillage would, like I said, be pretty disruptive to the soil, but no-till agriculture, which is a type of conservation tillage, does preparing for planting in a way that is much less disruptive to the soil. And some of these residues from the previous year's crops can sit there and act almost like green manure that can add fertility to the soil. Now, when I first heard of no-till farming, in my head, I couldn't imagine how you would plant seeds without tilling. I'm not a farmer, I'm not from an agriculture area. So in my head, I was imagining like someone having to go through and poke with their finger down into the soil to plant the seeds. But this little clip really did a nice job of explaining that to me.
So how exactly do these farmers plant without plowing? Most use no-till planters, which are designed to slice through plant residues from previous harvests, while minimizing soil disturbance as they plant the seeds for their crops. Here's how it works. Pulled by a tractor, a no-till planter uses thin, rotating discs to make a narrow slice through the plant residue and into the soil. Next, a tube places the seed at an appropriate depth in the soil, while a second wheel gently presses or firms the seed into the soil to ensure proper seed-to-soil contact.
Pretty cool. All right, and the last little strategy we're going to talk about is liming. So one thing that farmers have to study about their soil is the pH, how acidic it is. Acidic soils pose some unique problems. One of the problems of acidic soil is that it can liberate or make soluble more aluminum, and that aluminum can actually be toxic to plant roots. And it might disrupt the range of tolerance, or it might be outside the range of tolerance for the soil microbes. We know how important those are for soil health. And so if our soil is too acidic, one thing you can do is to add limestone to it. That's rich in calcium carbonate. And what that's going to do is it's going to reduce that acidity. It's going to raise the pH. Again, it reduces the risk of aluminum toxicity, it improves microbial activity, and it helps to kind of maintain that soil's cation exchange capacity, the soil's ability to hang on to nutrients for plants to be able to use. There's another nice picture of this farmer putting lime on his fields. All right, let's do a quick multiple choice question. An integrated pest management approach to pest control emphasizes which of the following? Take 12.5 seconds. So we would want to reduce crop damage to an economically tolerable level. That's one of the goals of IPM. All right, so what did we do today? We looked at irrigation method, pest control methods, meat production methods. So we talked about standard practices here, but then we talked about IPM and other practices of agriculture that put us in a much more sustainable zone. And then we also practiced scientific experiments, practice number 4 with our bumblebee fungicide study. And that's actually what I'm going to leave you with for homework tonight, is a great FRQ that asks you to practice your experimental design skills. This is all about pesticide X. So this is asking you to devise an experiment to determine how toxic that pesticide is to small fish. And then it asks you to talk about IPM a little bit. And it finally asks you to talk about 2 agricultural practices that increase crop yields. So when we're all done, be sure you go back and pause it here and read over the questions, and Ms. Fassler will go over that next time. So again, by this Friday, please reach out to the URL below if you yourself or you know anyone else who needs some solutions about connectivity and internet access or mobile tools in preparation for the exam. All right, apes, happy Earth Day, and I'll see you next time.